I didn't expect to be reunited with Stanley Sheridan. He was dressed in a well-cut suit, with cold eyebrows and eyes, and leaned lazily on the edge of the sofa. A table away, Clark Teresa smiled and poured me a glass of water. What are you doing so nervous? The corners of his lips twitched. I don't eat people. Of course I wasn't afraid of him. But, the man's scarlet eyes, clasped hands, and naked skin reflected in the glass window flashed through my mind. Stanley Sheridan is a madman. I can't mess with him anymore. I cowered in the corner, desperately trying to lower my presence. Clark Teresa is a well-known playboy with a good voice. Dean Sassoon, go out on a date with me. Be serious. Clark Teresa, you're dead. My heart beat suddenly. For a while, I regretted my decision to agree to my friend's decision to go on a blind date. Taking advantage of the gap between him going to the bathroom, I took my bag and sneaked away. As soon as he got up, his skirt accidentally hung on the corner of the table, revealing his fair skin. A shadow fell beside me, and I looked up and crashed into Stanley Sheridan's deep eyes. I reminded myself repeatedly. He had amnesia and didn't remember anything, but his legs still went limp. He frowned slightly, subconsciously stretched out his hand, and I threw it into his arms, as if I was throwing myself into my arms. Surrounded by a faint scent of pine, my ears were red. The girl who had just sat across from Stanley Sheridan rushed over angrily in her high heels. I've never seen such a thick-skinned person hit someone in broad daylight. I don't care what I look like. Stanley Sheridan, will take a blind look at you. Stanley Sheridan is the only son of the wealthy Sheridan family, and since he took charge of the family, there has never been a shortage of warblers and swallows around him. After following him for so long, I naturally knew what kind of woman he hated the most. The man's palms are hot, and there is a hint of confusion in his magnetic voice. Why do you seem to see somewhere? Can't let him remember? I tugged at his tie, rubbed my left hand against his chest, and said, Stanley Sheridan, people can't walk anymore. Stanley Sheridan's eyes were cold. The people around me waited to see in what position I was thrown out of the door. Another who is not afraid of death. The last one who slipped into Stanley Sheridan's arms is still lying in the hospital. Until Stanley Sheridan grimaced and said in the coldest voice, hog or back. It's like it's been rehearsed 1,000 times. The eyes of the people around them widened instantly. He was stunned for a moment, then suddenly let go of his hand. I was also stunned, and took advantage of the high-heeled woman to come and make trouble, and ran away. I've been with Stanley Sheridan since I was 20. His family background is illustrious, and my family has only become rich due to demolition in recent years, and he is still very different. From the very beginning, it was understood that there was nothing to be achieved with such a person. But Stanley Sheridan is handsome, rich, and in good shape. There's no shame in sleeping with him. That's 4 years of sleep. During the day, he is the noble and cold young master of the Sheridan family. At night, he's the Sven scum, who imprisoned me at the bedside. Maybe it's because of the old age, everyone from all walks of life has begun to watch, scrambling to send their daughter to Sheridan's house first. I occasionally lie in his arms and play with my phone, and I will see a lot of lace news. I pretended to be stupid and slid by. That is, until Stanley Sheridan sensed that something was wrong. Don't you ask me? He's testing me. I shook my head. Stanley Sheridan's eyes were a little cold, and she shook me out of her arms. I grabbed his hand and said with a firm look in my eyes, I believe in you. His fried hair was just a few minutes smoother. I added, even if it were true, I wouldn't be angry. It's normal to like several people at the same time. Do whatever you want, and remember to do it. I don't know how Stanley Sheridan came to the conclusion. So, who else is in your heart but me? Me, there are a lot of people. The newly bought bed collapsed that night. It was also from that day on that Stanley Sheridan was like a different person. The juniors who gave me love letters during the day disappeared overnight. My boss who asked me to dinner had a car accident for some reason. A friend I was working on the design with suddenly went bankrupt and jumped off the building due to the pressure. I was vaguely aware that it all had something to do with him. Stanley Sheridan is a madman. Or rather, he's been crazy all along. The month I decided to leave, I was so attentive to Stanley Sheridan that he gradually lost his guard. Pregnancy is not an accident. After all, his genes are good enough, and I also want a child. At the door of the restaurant, a friend picked up Baird Sassoon, who had just finished school. I was holding my daughter's hand to leave, but was stopped by Clark Teresa, who was chasing after me. It was probably my evasive attitude that provoked the playboy's desire to conquer. His peach eyes narrowed. This is our daughter. As early as when I first came into contact, I revealed that I had a 4-year-old daughter. Baird Sassoon, despite his young age, is clearly a ghost elf. She raised a pretty little face, and Grandma asked, "Who is this handsome guy?" The praise in the child's mouth is always extra credible. Clark Teresa was amused, and took her in his arms, his voice exceptionally soft. "Good, call Daddy." Baird Sassoon. "Me. You. Don't take advantage of us." There was footsteps approaching behind him. Stanley Sheridan followed at some point. Clark Teresa apparently knew him as well, and after a few pleasantries, he suddenly turned to Baird Sassoon, who was in his arms. "Good, say hello to Uncle." Baird Sassoon had just eaten the candy he had given, and he was in a good mood, and his voice was loud. "Uncle, it's like a family of 3 and an outsider meeting by chance." If it had been before, Clark Theris's grave grass would have been green. I suddenly choked on my saliva, turning to look at Stanley Sheridan. His face was as usual, still the breezy Stanley Sheridan. "It's just that the palms that have always been white have a few deep nail marks," he answered, meaning unclear. "Your daughter." He smiled as if he hadn't done it. "It looks like me. It's inexplicably cold." The heart I lifted finally fell. Stanley Sheridan really forgot thoroughly. At night, after putting Baird Sassoon to sleep, I secretly asked 2 friends for a drink. During this time, my clothes were accidentally wet with alcohol, and the bartender at the bar gave me his shirt. My friend was a little curious. "Dean Sassoon, don't you like to drink?" I used to drink too, but Stanley Sheridan always sent people to squat at me, in front of the various bars. One squat, one accurate, but now it's different. He had amnesia. It seems that it will be difficult to recover. My good days are coming. I didn't expect it. As soon as I got out of the bar, I was tied up. Sure enough, as the fortune teller said, it is not advisable to go out today. My heart was pounding, and the moment I saw Stanley Sheridan, it instantly lifted my throat. The inky windows of the car covered the dim night, making his face particularly hazy. Stanley Sheridan nodded to his side. "Sit." "I don't know. What kind of medicine is sold in the gourd?" It's been too long since I've been alone with Stanley Sheridan, and I'm obviously a little nervous and unnaturally, looking away. Isn't Stanley Sheridan's way of inviting people too rude? Am I being rude to you? He froze. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask something." Did he remember something? My head was spinning. Stanley Sheridan turned to Douglas, who was following him. "You go out first." The assistant stepped on his thigh. What did he want him to go out for? On a big night, 2 people are alone in the car. How embarrassing. I coughed quickly. "Don't go. Stanley Sheridan and I have just met, and there's nothing that no one else can't hear." The assistant's leg was retracted. I said, "Ask whatever you want." Stanley Sheridan stopped talking. Turning to suppress his voice, he said in a voice that only 2 people could hear, "You. Is there a mole there?" There was silence all around. I swallowed. "TSK, who knew you were going to ask that kind of question? First meeting, isn't it rude?" I closed my eyes, turned to the assistant in front of me, who was desperately trying to reduce my presence, and gritted my teeth. "You go out first." Douglas had a few big words above his head. "I can't hear anything," and the foot that had just fallen stretched out again. As Stanley Sheridan said, he had long ago lost his memory and forgotten something, but he always dreamed of a woman. The 2 were very close in the dream, but he couldn't see her clearly, he only remembered her. There's a mole." In his sincere eyes, I swallowed the word, "spring dream," and said, "I have." His pupils tightened, and at the moment when he was about to pounce on him, I pretended to be shy and added, "If Stanley Sheridan likes it, I can go get one." The affection in his eyes faded in an instant, and he was dyed with a hint of anger after being played. I tugged at my loose shirt and sighed in annoyance. "It's just that I already have a lover, and a 4-year-old child. If Stanley Sheridan doesn't mind, we can also be separated for a while. After all, children can't be without their own father." The more she spoke, the colder Stanley Sheridan's eyes became. He didn't say a word, just gently unbuttoned the cufflinks and smiled coldly. "I'm amnesia. Not dead. He lowered his eyes, and his eyes fixed on me. Dean Sassoon, tell me the truth. I clenched my palms and sweated slightly. Amnesiac Stanley Sheridan is also so difficult to fool. Fortunately, when we were together, I was always careful to leave later. Almost no one remembered my appearance, and deleted all my photos on Stanley Sheridan's phone before leaving. Even the people close to him only knew one person named Hogan Smith, never the name Dean Sassoon. But now Stanley Sheridan seems to remember something, and I must have known him before. It's just that I can't be Hogan Smith anymore, and I don't want anyone around me to be hurt by Stanley Sheridan being a madman. So I immediately made up another story. Stanley Sheridan wants to ask Hogan Smith, right? Where is she? I pinched my thighs and shed 2 tears. She's dead. Stanley Sheridan's face turned pale. In order to make him hate me, I just added fuel and set a fire. He died because he saved me. I had a dry mouth and brainwashed him for 2 hours. Hogan Smith was his old sweetheart, and I was a friend of Hogan Smith, and when we broke up, Hogan Smith came to me, and died in a car accident. There are a lot of holes in this story, but the words Hogan Smith is dead seem to touch on some memory of Stanley Sheridan. His eyelashes twitched, and unexpectedly, he asked someone to take me away without asking anything. What feelings does an amnesiac person have for an old lover? I thought Stanley Sheridan would forget about Hogan Smith, and live the rest of his life. Until Douglas, who was beside him, came to me again. The old lady said, "Give you 10 million, stay with Stanley Sheridan." Things seem to be starting to go wrong. Fortunately, I'm not one to bend my waist for 10 million. I shook my head, determined not to be moved by any amount of money. Douglas sighed helplessly, waved his hand, and said indifferently, "Then I'll have to invite Dean Sassoon." Suddenly, several strong men appeared behind me with starry eyes, as if they could have a job to do if I didn't say a word. I immediately turned cold. "You're welcome. Why bother saying please? I'll walk over there myself." In my impression, although Sheridan's family is a big family, they are polite and never embarrassed. This exception was made because of Stanley Sheridan's status. It's just too bad. Ever since the last time he saw me, he had locked himself in his room and been drunk. The servants who passed by said, "Stanley Sheridan, this is evil." It's already a lot better, but who knows, it's not normal lately. It's not normal since 5 years ago, always talking about a woman named Hogan Smith, but no one has ever seen her. Even if there is such a person, he will not be able to look down on us Stanley Sheridan if he is blind. "Dean Sassoon, you said yes." Seeing that I was silent, it seemed to be commonplace, and whispered comfortingly, "Don't be afraid. Stanley Sheridan will definitely drive you away later. You can go directly to the old lady to collect the money and leave. Returning to this house, I can't put it into words. 5 years ago, when I lived here, there weren't that many people, and I never let Stanley Sheridan bring people over because I like to be quiet. I tried my best to hold back my trembling fingers, and pushed open the familiar door. The room is not very large, and the windowsill is planted with fresh greenery, and you can see the ginkgo trees in the summer, and the snow falling in the winter. Everything was arranged according to my liking, except that the floor was covered with wrinkled sketches. The same woman is depicted in the painting, but the face is not depicted at all. Stanley Sheridan sat on the edge of the bed, her broken hair covering her dark eyes, and her left hand was streaked with blood from the shattered glass. It was as if I had been punctured by a piece of glass. Subconsciously, I wanted to comfort him. He looked up for a moment. "Hogan Smith. 5 years have passed, and I haven't suppressed my voice. In an instant, memories swarmed up. Hold my Stanley Sheridan. Stanley Sheridan, who coaxed me to eat when I was sick. Bunker Sheridan, who took over the entire playground, and set off fireworks for me. But, he was the one who locked me in my room, and wouldn't let me go anywhere. The junior who was in trouble just because he sent me a love letter. And the colleague who fell in front of me from a tall building that day. Looming, Stanley Sheridan, as if drunk, grabbed my hands and pressed me against the wall. Tiny kisses spread from the forehead to the lips. Several servants next to him were stunned, and let out a piercing scream. I came to my senses, took the water from the flowers next to me, and splashed it in his face. Water droplets dripped from the sharp jaws, and were hidden in the soaked shirt. The temperature on his body was terrifyingly hot. I turned my head and said, "Stanley Sheridan, you can see who I am." The cold temperature in the eyes of the sane Stanley Sheridan returned. In his heart, the forgotten Hogan Smith has always been his obsession, and I am the one who indirectly killed Hogan Smith. He doesn't hate me, but he must hate it. But I'm the only one who knows the details of how they get along with each other. Sometimes I can't figure out why Stanley Sheridan can still trust me so much, even though she has forgotten about me. Is there any man's sixth sense in the dark? For the next few days, Stanley Sheridan said, never in front of me, but she always showed up every once in a while. Don't get me wrong, only his mouth was hard. I just want to know about Hogan Smith. You can ask for it, of course. He tightened his sleeve. Don't think anything wrong of me. I shook my head. It's too tiring to make up stories. One is also easy to expose if you are not careful. Stanley Sheridan took my daughter's hand next to her. His eyes inexplicably became gentle. Your name is Baird Sassoon. Baird Sassoon traveled the world with one sentence. Uncle, you are so handsome. Stanley Sheridan asked. Really? Is it more handsome than your father? Looking at the two similar faces in front of me, I was excited. I'm afraid that Stanley Sheridan can't think of doing a paternity test with Baird Sassoon for a while. In the face of established evidence, I can't tell even if I have 800 mouths. In desperation, I tugged at Stanley Sheridan's sleeve. What do you want to know? I'll make it up. Shay. His eyes were cold, and he gritted his teeth and said, let go. Good. Previously, finding Hogan Smith was his only thought, and now, embarrassing me has become one of the few pleasures in his life. Compared with the decadence of some time ago, the whole person is obviously much more vibrant. I still play a character that he hates. For example, I told him that he and Hogan Smith had always been sweet, but I was jealous of Hogan Smith and learned from her everywhere. I said, Hogan Smith is an orphan and only one good friend of mine, so he always lets me go everywhere. The first few times he was always sneering at me. Today it was a little strange. Yesterday, because I was in a hurry to go out, I accidentally fell and injured my hand. Stanley Sheridan, on the other hand, was absent-minded, staring at my broken wrist. The atmosphere was a little weird, but he bowed his head and said in a low tone, it stands to reason that I should hate you. But why do I feel so sad to see you hurt? As he spoke, the corners of his eyes turned red and wet. Me. And I'm still thinking about how to lie to him more reasonably. I can't make it up. After my hand injury was healed, on the night of Tanabata, I suddenly had a dream. In my dream, I met Stanley Sheridan 5 years ago, sweating profusely, the lights swaying. I bit him on the shoulder and said it hurt. I woke up from a big dream, and I suddenly thought, between me and Stanley Sheridan, try again. This thought continued until Clark Teresa came to me. I heard that tomorrow is your birthday. Why didn't you tell me? I don't know which tendon is wrong with Clark Teresa, and the more I reject him, the more he wants to come up. In the name of beauty, he likes women who don't like him or not. The leaves fell, and he leaned over to cut my hair, and I didn't have time to hide before I was caught off guard. I didn't know that this angle was particularly ambiguous. Through his shoulder, I saw a familiar figure, Stanley Sheridan, dressed in a black trench coat with a delicate face without the slightest emotion, closed the car door and left without saying anything. I felt uneasy. The next day, a friend suddenly called to say that Clark Teresa had been stabbed with a knife and was bleeding profusely when she had gone out to buy breakfast this morning. She asked if she wanted to see him one last time. I don't know why. My first reaction was, it was Stanley Sheridan who did it. So, when he showed up at my door again, I slapped him uncontrollably. He lowered his eyes, very lonely, and his eyes were full of anger. Why? I said, you know it in your heart. Stanley Sheridan even has a question mark on her eyebrows. I said, you're a madman, Mom. Baird Sassoon said from behind him, looking confused. Uncle helped me teach my classmates, who bullied me last time, and I invited him to dinner. I don't have time to bother with Baird Sassoon. My relationship with Clark Teresa wasn't good, but he was innocent. On the way to Clark Teresa, I couldn't even figure out how to go to the police station to report the crime. In the spirit of not being able to help the abuse, the moment I hurriedly pushed the door open, A crowd poured out. Clark Teresa was intact and even holding a bouquet of flowers. Surprise. Happy birthday. Like the surprise. Me. My eyes widened, frightened by the shock. I misunderstood Stanley Sheridan and hit him. Clark Teresa. I thank you. Recently, the Sheridan family group has been rumored that Stanley Sheridan is 30 years old and has reached menopause. Specifically, he had a black face during the meeting, and scolded the deserted manager for being bloody, although the company stipulates that office romance is not allowed, as long as it does not affect work. Everyone has always turned a blind eye. One day, Stanley Sheridan passed by a flirtatious couple, and although their faces were expressionless, they issued a notice of expulsion in the blink of an eye. Even Douglas had to hide in the toilet to send messages to his girlfriend. He was miserable and came to me again. Sister, save everyone. Every time Stanley Sheridan looks at you, the corners of her mouth almost rise to the sky. What you say must be useful. I insisted that I didn't know Stanley Sheridan well. Douglas acted like a thief and pulled out a tin box with a code. This box is important to Stanley Sheridan, but he can't open it. Maybe he knew you before he lost his memory, and he had a crush on you. He threw the box off and ran. I chased after him and tried to give it back, but I saw Douglas around the corner and snorted. Don't think I don't know. Stanley Sheridan was beaten by you. He took out his phone again and sent a voice message to someone for some reason. You know what? Stanley Sheridan was beaten. No, it's a girl. Listen to me. Stanley Sheridan's assistant is not time to change again. I thought about it for a moment, and took out the lockbox again. Tried my birthday hopelessly. Click. It's on. Inside is a diary. Recorded the bits and pieces that happened between us. It turns out that Stanley Sheridan has often dreamed of me since we met. The things in the dream will be fulfilled one by one in reality. I was supposed to die in a drunken fight, but that day Stanley Sheridan grabbed me, and didn't let me go out. The younger brother who disappeared after sending me love letters was never a good person. He suffered from depression, and because I had enlightened and encouraged him, he wanted to take me back to my hometown in a daze, and stay with him all the time. Stanley Sheridan gave his parents a sum of money to take him abroad for treatment. The boss who invited me to dinner was actually trying to uncover the rules of me, and Stanley Sheridan sent someone to warn him, but he was too timid and had a car accident on the way back. My friend, who was working on the design with me, was in danger of going bankrupt, and he just found out about my relationship with Stanley Sheridan, and wanted to kidnap me and threaten him. I used to think that Stanley Sheridan was too scary and controlled me at every turn. I was mad, trying to run away from him, ignoring everything. He was out of the ordinary. I never thought of it. I should have died 5 years ago. I knew I couldn't let Baird Sassoon follow me anymore. I want to send her back to Sheridan's house, so that at least she can be safe. In the Mid-Autumn Festival, Sheridan's family held a dinner party. I forfeited the last time I was paid for her errands for the Sheridan family, and exchanged it for a chance to come to dinner. Seeing me appear, Stanley Sheridan's face stinked even more, and she should still remember the last revenge. The Mid-Autumn Festival is always a time of reunion. When we first got together, Stanley Sheridan always thought I could have a reunion dinner with him. As I passed him, I whispered, I'm sorry I misunderstood you for many years, and hit you for no reason. My heart ached for a while. How sad it must have been for Stanley Sheridan to be thrown down by me, in the first place. Now that he has forgotten everything, it can be regarded as a relief. His pupils narrowed, and he grabbed my wrist. Dean Sassoon, I've never been wrong like this when I've grown up. If it weren't for, I bowed my head, deeply ashamed. The woman who was with the old lady noticed the movement. The old lady had a son when she was nearly 40 years old, and now she was 30 years old but did not have a family, and the old lady had no hope of holding her grandson, so she simply wanted to choose a daughter-in-law directly. Ian Robert was the wife she chose for Stanley Sheridan. She arranged the dinner party carefully, and her every move was generous and decent. Even when she saw me, she never showed any dissatisfaction. It's just that when she passed by Baird Sassoon, who was concentrating on eating mooncakes, she pretended to be surprised and said, "This is Dean Sassoon's daughter. She is so beautiful." Her voice was not loud. "Why don't you see your father coming? Your mother gave birth to you before she got married." I know what she means. openly and secretly sarcastically mocking my improper style. I didn't bother with her. I wanted to find the old lady alone, but I never found the opportunity, so I simply bypassed Ian Robert and faced the old lady. He shouted to Baird Sassoon, "Baird Sassoon, call Grandma." I handed the paternity test results to someone. There was silence for a moment. Then there was a small discussion. "Damn, did you hear me right? When did Stanley Sheridan have such a daughter? Didn't you say Stanley Sheridan couldn't do it at all? Wealthy. It's normal to have a few illegitimate children. And this may not be Stanley Sheridan's children. Mom." Stanley Sheridan was also blindsided. "You still have a baby outside." The old lady's reputation was not guaranteed in her later years, and she was so angry that she gave him a hammer. "Bastard thing. That's your child." The old lady was angry, but she was clearly in love with Baird Sassoon. No wonder I feel a sense of familiarity at the first sight of this child. I look so much like me when I was younger. "Here, Grandma, hug." But Stanley Sheridan and I are miserable. Before the old lady could come up with a solution, we were locked up in the Sheridan ancestral hall to confess. Stanley Sheridan closed her eyes and thought about it for a long time, but she couldn't figure out how this kid came to be. "You, at the beginning." He paused, then his eyes went cold again. "Dean Sassoon. You liar. It's hard for me to deceive me. I was so immersed in the pain of being separated from my child that I didn't notice anything was wrong with Stanley Sheridan." I sniffled. "I'll leave the child to your care in the future." I was scared that since I was a man destined to have no future, it would be more dangerous for Baird Sassoon to follow me. After all, I don't know when the next death will come. Unlike me. Stanley Sheridan folded her arms and pursed her lips for a long time before she said unnaturally, "You're going to chase me again. If other boyfriends have it, you have to give it to me. I'm a person who can't stand the grievances of no name anymore." I didn't understand for a moment. Stanley Sheridan lowered her eyes, avoiding my gaze, and suddenly chuckled as if she had figured something out. "Forget it. Actually, I don't remember much about the past, but I still remember every time I made a mistake in the past." Stanley Sheridan was determined to ignore me. "In the end, they will helplessly say, 'Forget it, he always spoils me like this. How can he hurt me? It's always been me.' Misunderstood him for many years." Thinking of this, tears flowed down my face. Stanley Sheridan panicked, wiping my face with her hands and feet. He said, "Don't cry. If you don't chase me, actually, it's not that you can't be together without a name." Douglas, who pushed the door in, probably only heard his last words. His eyes were full of Stanley Sheridan. "You scumbag," he said solemnly. "Dean Sassoon, old lady please." In the past, Sheridan's family had more or less the right concept, but since Stanley Sheridan was married in the first year, the old lady only wanted him to bring someone back, even if it was a man. Now that she even has a granddaughter, she is as happy as a windfall. So, she called me over to discuss my marriage to Stanley Sheridan. I was stunned for a long time and didn't slow down. In the end, Stanley Sheridan refused on the grounds of amnesia. Stanley Sheridan's attitude towards me was almost a 180-degree turn. He would boil my favorite soup, and he burned his hands because he had never been in the kitchen. I would use a picture of me and Baird Sassoon as a phone screen, and occasionally glimpsed it during a meeting and laughed secretly. Will avoid the moment a strange girl approaches, for fear that I will misunderstand if I am not careful. Ian Robert also didn't understand why Stanley Sheridan, who had never been close to women, suddenly had a 4-year-old child. She wore sunglasses and ripped off her mask. "Your name is Dean Sassoon," I said. "Yes." She asked, "Is there any other name?" In order not to bother, I decisively denied it. "Nope." The corners of her lips twitched, satisfied. "Do you know Hogan Smith?" "Actually, I don't like Stanley Sheridan. It's just a man. I have it all around," she said. "But I'm curious, when Hogan Smith comes back, will he choose you or her?" Ian Robert and Stanley Sheridan have been in the same school since he was a child, and because of their acquaintance at home, the two have crossed paths a lot. But at the time, Stanley Sheridan was focused on gaining knowledge. She originally thought that he was just in love, but who knew that the person who rarely got together with everyone was almost gone for a while. Later, it was very difficult for someone to ask him out, and at the party, Someone asked him what he had been doing lately. He said, "I'm with Hogan Smith." "Who?" "My future wife." She took a sip of her coffee and said meaningfully, "Stanley Sheridan wanted to marry Hogan Smith at that time." After she left, I walked alone by the lake. There was a burst of exclamation from the crowd. Someone stole something, and the thief panicked and bumped into me. My feet slipped and I fell from the shore into the deep water. Someone screamed, "Someone's overboard. Hurry up and save people." At the same time, a familiar voice came from afar, "Hogan Smith." The moment Stanley Sheridan pounced, I knew that he had already regained his memory. Stanley Sheridan seems to have forgotten. I know how to water, and he won't. Things got a little complicated for a while. At first, I fell into the water, and he went into the water to save me. In the end, I dragged him back to shore. Then, I was in a state of exhaustion and fainted. When I woke up, Stanley Sheridan was innocently crouching beside my bed, a 30-year-old man, alive like a child who has done something wrong and is waiting to be scolded. When Stanley Sheridan heard about his rescue by diving, several of Sheridan's partners came to sing his praises. Stanley Sheridan is not only young, but she also loves to help others. This man who fell into the water has to thank Stanley Sheridan. If he hadn't happened to pass by, what would have happened? Stanley Sheridan has nothing to say about his character, and to work with him, we all have to burn incense. By the way, what about the Stanley Sheridan? Douglas said calmly, "Thank you for your concern. Stanley Sheridan has been rescued by someone who fell into the water." Douglas was rarely annoyed out of concern, and turned to Stanley Sheridan. "Stanley Sheridan, you don't know how to swim at all, so why don't you make a fuss?" I almost thought it was. "Why?" Stanley Sheridan raised his eyes to warn him to be cautious. Douglas choked, excused himself with unfinished work, and hurried away. The room was quiet for a long time. I opened my eyes and asked Stanley Sheridan, "When did you remember?" Actually, something was wrong with him early on, but I never noticed. He seemed to want to feign amnesia. "What do you remember?" He pretended, and I pretended. "Didn't you like Hogan Smith for a long time? And you have a child with me, so you don't be afraid of her and don't look at her. In order to be less condemned by our conscience, let's not have too much contact. Actually, I also have someone I've liked for a long time, and after the child is handed over to you, I can also go to him." Stanley Sheridan endured a sudden pain in her temples, suddenly interrupted me. "Hogan Smith. That's enough. Stanley Sheridan is really amnesiac, and forgot about me. The day I misunderstood Clark Teresa for beating him, he had planned to die with me. It was also that day that he remembered everything." His eyes were clearly full of exhaustion, but he cheered up and comforted me. "It's all gone." I pinched my palms. "Can you really get over you?" I nodded and didn't hesitate to tell Douglas. "Well, I've read all of your diary." Douglas gave it to me. I think of the time when he saved me again and again, and I, again and again, lost my temper with him. "Aren't you afraid?" In the first place." Stanley Sheridan took me in her arms, and spoke in a low voice. "It's okay, I'm hard." I asked Stanley Sheridan if she ever thought about leaving me. After all, always dreaming of a person's death is a torturous thing to torture yourself. He was honest. I thought about it, but I couldn't do it. He knew me well, so he didn't tell me anything. In the past, I loved freedom, and if I knew everything, I would probably only say, "Death is death. You just got a new one." If you are restrained in everything you do, it is better to die calmly. But not anymore. I wrapped my arms around Stanley Sheridan's waist tightly. "I'll listen to you from now on." In fact, on the other hand, if he could have known in advance that something would happen to me, it would not be a way to avoid risks. I owe him a lot. If he wants to, from now on, I will always be with him. Clark Teresa called me again when he came back from a trip. "How's that? Do you miss me? Where's Baird Sassoon?" I glanced at the door and said calmly, "Oh, her dad is putting shoes on her." I said, "By the way, don't message me anymore. Her dad is not happy to see it." Clark Teresa hesitated for a few seconds. "Did something happen?" Stanley Sheridan took the phone and said lightly, "Welcome to the wedding wine." After a brief silence on the other end of the line, he hung up. It was pouring rain outside the window. Inside, Stanley Sheridan unleashed her belt and hugged me in her lap. I remember what I had forgotten. Baird Sassoon is out of school. His voice was slurred. I asked Douglas to pick it up. The roots of my ears are hot. Douglas isn't going on a date. Woo. Probably because Douglas always showed affection in front of him. Stanley Sheridan was already dissatisfied, and said angrily, his wife has been with him for 5 years. And I haven't had a wife with me for 5 years. He grabbed me back from the corner of the bed. Stay with me. The male protagonist's perspective is extra. I love Dean Sassoon. I've always known that. When did this relationship begin? Presumably, while I was at the desk on business. She smiled softly at me by the window. Probably in the night, I rolled over, and she woke up, shrunk into my arms, and coquettishly, probably, when the earthquake struck, she didn't hesitate to rush upstairs to find me who was sick. I don't know, when I started to have the ability to dream about her future. Sadly, I wasn't there for her when she was hurt in the dream. That feeling of helplessness is very hopeless. And knowing in advance what was going to happen, it was hard for me not to limit her movements. I sometimes think that if only I kept her around all the time, there would be no accidents. The idea is crazy. It also hurt her deeply. She's gone. Also took away everything related to her. I lost my memory. I forgot a very important person. Oddly enough, I still dream about her a lot. I dream that I call her Hogan Smith. I dream that she dies in an accident. For a long time, I thought I was mentally wrong, until I met the woman named Dean Sassoon. Her lies were clumsy, but the fact that she said that Hogan Smith was dead coincided with the scene in my dream. I should hate her, but I'm greedy for the feeling of being with her. Later I found out that she was Hogan Smith. When I regained my memory, she was already with me and had a baby. I was crazy and wanted to rush over to her and ask her whose child it was. I thought again, she dislikes me so much, lied to me, avoided me, and was afraid of me. Between us, is it long overdue to break the two? But in front of her, I was full of anger, and it all turned into a sentence. Forget it, never mind. It's good that you're by my side. I regret missing 4 important years of Baird Sassoon's life. So after that, I always wanted to double my compensation for her. It was snowing on New Year's Day, and Dean Sassoon was sleeping in the house, and I pinched the quilt for her, shut the door. I went out for a snowball fight with Baird Sassoon in my arms. Baizu's eyes were very smart. She raised her little face and asked, Daddy, can you stay with me forever? I said, yes, I rarely lie. The person I can always be with is Dean Sassoon. She is born, and I am born. She died, I die. The end.